I can't tell you how often in my life I have heard that people are weak for seeking out therapy. I 100% disagree with you and will always disagree with you. The courage and the strength it takes those people to walk into my office and talk to me about the most vulnerable places in their life, the things that make them scared that they're a worthless piece of crap, is far more strength or courage than anyone will have trying to pretend like they don't have something they're struggling with.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 31 of the Andrew Deitch podcast. I'm officially back from my journey around Europe, and I was meaning to get this episode out sooner, but I was in Amsterdam and I couldn't find a time to record this thing, and then I was in Milan for one night and I couldn't find a quiet place to record without waking people up. So here we are, a few days later, back in Atlanta, but I think all of you can forgive me. Most importantly, I had the most magical weekend at Tomorrowland, and I got to hang out with so many friends from around the world and met so many new people. The music and the festival is absolutely spectacular, of course, but the people you meet and the friendships that you make there are really what stick with you. That's what makes traveling so awesome for me, is the connections. I love meeting people from all over. But anyways, I'm super jet lagged, and I need to get this episode out, so let's do it. My guest today is my friend, Danielle Turmaud, and she just finished her master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and for the past 5 years, she's been working with survivors of all kinds of trauma. And just to name a few things that she's also done, she's gone to the red light districts of India to work with women and children there. For the past year, she's been counseling survivors of trauma at Grady Hospital. She's going to be teaching psychology classes at Georgia Highlands College in the fall. And she is also a researcher regarding the subjects of trauma and women's studies. And as you probably know, mental health is a pretty big issue these days, getting a lot of attention. And I think that the topics that Danielle and I discussed today are extremely important because many people view mental health in the wrong light, I think, and sometimes have the wrong ideas. And it's amazing to have people like Danielle who are such strong advocates for people dealing with trauma and mental illness, and who can help us better understand how to support our fellow men and women who are dealing with that kind of stuff and are typically misunderstood. So, without any further ado, here is my friend Danielle Turmaud. All right, Danielle, we're live.
Hi, Andrew.
We're officially live.
Great.
Broadcasting to the World Wide Web.
That sounds great to me.
Well, it's not really live because it's just going to be sitting on this little SD card, but until I upload it.
Okay.
But pretend that we're live. No, but yeah, so this is your first podcast, right?
Yes.
This is my 31st podcast, so now I'm like not as nervous as I used to be when I would start these, because at the beginning I was like, how do I even start? Because once I kind of get going, it's just like so easy. It's just like talking to somebody, but like in the beginning you're like, what do I say to start this weird thing off? But most of my podcasts have kind of like started off just giving like having my guest like share their story a little bit of like how they got to where they are, you know?
Okay.
Because a lot of times, you know, we tend to think of people as just like, Danielle is this.
Right.
Like, I've only known you for like a year.
Right.
So it's like, I only know Danielle of like 1 year. But obviously, Danielle has been a work in progress for many, many years.
Right.
So just kind of give people like a context of that and like where you grew up and siblings and just like a fast forward.
Okay.
Because that plays like a big role in that. Obviously, like you're a counselor, so you know how much that
does.
Like plays.
All right. I'll try and summarize this to the best of my abilities. I have a lot of different dynamics and pieces. So my name is Danielle Turmaud. I recently finished my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. And for the past 5 or so years, I've been working with survivors of trauma in a variety of capacities, whether it's in a residential facility with survivors of sexual exploitation, at a sexual assault center as an advocate. I've gone to the red light districts of India a couple of times to work with women and children there. I've done a bunch of other random things in that field, but I'm now, over the past year, I've been counseling survivors of trauma at Grady Hospital. and I've absolutely loved it. And I am now going to be in private practice in Marriott in Rome, counseling survivors of trauma. And tell me if I'm talking too fast. This is a lot of information.
No, that's good.
And so I will be doing that, and I'm going to be teaching psychology classes at Georgia Highlands College.
Oh, no way. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, so
that's really cool.
I'm very excited. I have a passion to be a counselor and be a professor. In counseling and psychology, so people can be great clinicians. And so that is where I am now. And then I'll backtrack. I was born in Tampa, Florida. I am one of a lot of kids. I am the oldest of 5 in my mom's house, and I have a twin brother, but I'm 6 minutes older than him, so I'm going to take that as the oldest. And then at my dad's, I have 4 other siblings, so I'm the oldest of, I guess, 6 technically there, if you want to count my twin brother. And so a lot of siblings, a lot of love, and let me see what else.
How much of a separation is there between like the youngest and you?
So my youngest sister is 12 years younger than me. So when I'm 30, she's going to be graduating high school. It's going to be fantastic.
And how old are you right now?
I am almost 25.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
So you're not that much older than me.
No, we're pretty similar in age.
I know, I thought we were, but I wasn't 100% sure. Sometimes that's a rude question to ask women too, you know?
No, it's fine.
But like, I feel like you're young enough.
Age gives you wisdom, so I think it's fine.
That's very true. Yeah, I think that people that are so ashamed of it are, you know, I don't know, they're looking at it the wrong way, I feel like.
It's just culture.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things I can say about culture.
For sure.
The way it shapes the way we see each other and things like that, but you'll get me on a rant, so we won't even go there.
Of course. No, we can rant about that as we go, for sure. But so you're like the oldest, and so obviously like being the oldest, that plays like a pretty big role in things, because you're also like the first of everything. Like your parents are still trying to figure it out, like you're the first one, so all that kind of stuff. And then when did you so like if there's any milestones along the way, like what kind of like shaped you, and when did you move here and all that kind of stuff?
So when I was younger, before I was the age of 2, we moved around. I think we lived in Tennessee and Kentucky. I obviously don't remember all of that. And we moved when I was 5 to Kennesaw, Georgia. And so I've lived here ever since. I grew up, I guess something that I think of as a milestone is I grew up really, I wanted to be different things. I wanted to be a vet, or I wanted to be a teacher. I would sit there with my stuffed animals and teach to them. And I guess I am going to be a teacher now, but in a different way than I wanted to at that point. I was thinking I'd be teaching children, but I would set my stuffed animals up. I had this chalkboard and this whiteboard, and I was so proud of myself, and I would teach them the alphabet, and I actually taught my sisters the alphabet and stuff too. But anyways, so the teaching kind of was something that I grew up really, I guess, fostering within myself. So what's interesting is then I went to high school, and my whole life I've, and I don't mean this to sound strange in any way, but I was kind of that person that random people would talk to, and I always thought it was weird and cool at the same time. So in high school, I would have people calling me who were having flashbacks from sexual assault, sometimes middle of the night, or friends who dealt with schizophrenia who'd be calling me while they were having schizophrenic episodes and things like that. And I loved to do it. I loved to help, but it was draining and it was exhausting. I had some of my own stuff and maturity that I had needed to work through. And so it was exhausting to kind of pour myself out to people and not feel like I'm pouring back into myself. So I went to college after all of that and was like, I'm just going to be a teacher because I want to help people. I want to do this, but counseling is a lot of emotions, which obviously it is. So I went to school and decided I was going to major in education, and I started doing it, and I was like, heck no, I would be fired right away.
Why is that? Like from teaching kids, you're saying, or?
Yeah, so I loved the kid part of it, but I'm very individualized, and in the school system, you can't do that. There's a lot of politics, a lot of bureaucracy.
Unless you're in a really unique school.
Yes, and that's very hard to find. And I realized I would get fired quickly because I would open my mouth. I'm a huge fighter of justice, and I don't think some of the things are just that go on in education, with kids not being able to have their own individualized, learning fostered. And so I was like, yeah, that's not going to work out. And I was doing really well in my psychology classes. And I like I said, I kind of been fighting God my whole life on doing counseling, but I started getting healthier and maturing and taking care of myself. And I absolutely fell in love with psychology and counseling. So that was a huge milestone.
Yeah,
was
for sure.
kind of putting down my fists and doing what I was made to do. So
That's really cool. So in high school, you said like people were reaching out to you and stuff like that. Were they like your friends typically, or was it just like kind of people that were more acquaintances that just felt like you were someone they could talk to?
Kind of both. Usually they became friends though, just because I would see people who didn't really have friends. I wasn't ever really in a clique. I kind of just floated around, and anybody who was there I kind of befriended. But especially people who were kind of the oddballs, I never wanted them to feel left out. And so I would really befriend them and start talking to them in gym class or things like that. But other times it was my best friends or close friends or things like that who would just confide in me about different things. So kind of a combination of them.
Yeah. There is something weird about high school where there's like, you're forced to be in this group, and like there's just bound to be people that don't really feel like they belong. And so that's cool that you were able to like reach out to people like that and try to befriend them and stuff.
Well, and it's interesting.
But it also is draining.
Yeah, it was. I had no boundaries. Like I said, people would call me in the middle of the night, and I was completely fine with that because it felt good to be able to help people. But it wasn't healthy either, because now that I'm a therapist and I know what that looks like, I also was allowing them to become dependent on me, which also isn't healthy. There's a lot that goes to it. But
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because because ideally in a situation you'd want to move on, right? And I
want them to be able to cope without me.
Yeah, exactly.
And it became a situation where I like I said, I have a huge heart for justice, so I like to save and rescue. And now that I'm older, I'm mature, I know my strengths and my weaknesses. In therapy or just in life, I can challenge that. But when I was younger, I couldn't challenge that. I just kind of went with it because that was my instinct, was to save and rescue. And you can't do that.
Yeah.
To really help people, that actually is far more detrimental to people. So.
Yeah. There's I've been listening to this guy named Jordan Peterson a lot. Have you heard of this guy before?
I've heard of
the name. He's a clinical psychologist. I think that's like his official title, but he's been in the news a lot recently. And I know we can't do a ton into political stuff because of your current job situation, but one of the things that he's been on the news for is he's been protested against on college campuses for coming and speaking because he's saying things that people don't want to hear, and you know, they're protesting his speeches. But anyways, that's why he's been getting a lot of notoriety in the past year or so, I would say. But one of the things that he talks about, I'm listening to this lecture series that he's been doing all summer in Toronto, and one of the things that he's talking about is with justice. He's like talking about how it's a huge topic nowadays. Obviously, we've got this whole social justice movement and all this stuff like that. And one thing that he was talking about is like it's hardwired into us is the need to play fair. And even they've done studies on rats where rats, if they teach them to play, like rats already have like hardwired into them this need to play with things, and they play with each other and wrestle and all that. Right. But if one rat doesn't play fair, the other rats won't play with him anymore. And it's really weird how like we're hardwired for this, like we need to all play by the same rules. We need justice. We need everyone to be treated fairly, or I don't want to be a part of your game. Because if we're all socially agreeing to play this game that we call life, and you're not playing by the rules, we don't want to associate with you. And it is kind of weird because, you know, we think of like, oh, in our Western culture, we're so, you know, we've grown a lot, and, you know, we have a very advanced system, but it's like hardwired into us, this like need for justice. Because even in situations in other countries where justice isn't so prevalent, you know, people still want that. It's not like it's just something that we've like invented or something. It's like hardwired into our brains, like very, very deeply. And that's something like super interesting, and we can talk about that like a ton. But I wanted to like kind of wrap up your story a little bit. But so you decided to do psychology and your master's in what again?
Clinical mental health counseling.
So how long were you like in school for that? Because obviously a master's, that doesn't sound like a very short amount of time.
Yeah, so I obviously had my bachelor's degree in psychology and women's studies, and then I it took me 3 years. and I'm actually going to go for a PhD at some point. Right now I'm kind of a part-time professor, instructor, all different titles for it, doing professor things, but part-time. But to be a full-time professor, I'll need a PhD. And I one day would love to do that, and also to be able to supervise other clinicians who, like right now I'm supervised. So I will be I'm eligible for licensure as a licensed associate professional counselor and a nationally certified counselor. But because I am newer to the field, when you get into the field as a counselor, not a psychologist, but a counselor, they're similar but different. We won't go into all of that. It's complicated. But you have to be under supervision for about 3 years.
Gotcha.
To make sure that we're competent. It kind of like doctors, right? They do residency for multiple years. We have people's lives in our hands. So currently I'm under supervision. And so when I get my PhD, I would like to be a professor more longer term, and also continue to do my clinician work with trauma clients and be a supervisor. But it's interesting because at one point I just wanted to do work with trauma survivors. But now that I've done it for so long, I see the burnout rate is very high. I mean, it makes sense, right? I'm hearing some of the most traumatized people in the world tell me their stories and in detail. And as a human, that can take a toll on us. And so, even though sometimes I like to think I'm superhuman, I'm not. So I also need to have a buffer of working with people who might not have dealt with so many extreme traumatizing things. And like I said, I love it, but to be the healthiest clinician I can be, I also, working with students and working with other clinicians will be a good way to buffer that and do multiple things I love.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Can a counselor, or isn't that what you said? The difference is counselor versus
and psychologist.
Psychologist?
Yes.
Can either one of those prescribe medication?
No, only a psychiatrist can.
Gotcha.
So a psychiatrist is a doctor, pretty much, but think of it as like a psychological doctor. They can give medicine for bipolar, schizophrenia, all of those sorts of things, right? Psychologists, the difference is they have to get their PhD to have a clinical psychologist name. Another thing is that field, it's so strange, but psychology has actually been around longer than counseling, even though it's the same field to me because it's still psychology, right?
Yeah.
But they've had more years of that specific career kind of thing, if that makes sense. It's complicated. I'm trying to make it as easy as possible, but they can do a few things different than us. They obviously can do therapy like we can. They can diagnose, which we just recently, from what I understand, are now licensed professional counselors can now diagnose. So we're fighting for a lot of similar rights as in our field, but I'm trying to think what else they can do. One of the big differences is they can do assessment, so they can do testing, things like that. I'll never be able to do.
Gotcha.
Unless I get very specific specialized training. So at one point, I actually at Grady have worked with all psychologists, and it is a more renowned field nowadays just because of the way it's viewed and because they've been around longer. So at one point I was considering going to get my PhD to become a clinical psychologist, but that would be another 5 to 7 years to do everything I'm already doing, plus assessments and teaching. And the route I'm taking, I can become a professor and do everything I'm already doing as I'm doing it now with 3 or 4 years. So
gotcha.
I'm going to go that route.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
And a part of me is torn because it's, it would feel good to have the more renowned title, if that makes sense. And I hate that it is that way. It's politics.
It's all ego.
Yeah, it's a lot of politics behind it. But at the same time, my hope is if I'm, an ethical, the best clinician I can be, I'm hoping that I would still get the same amount of respect in the field, regardless of what our titles are.
Totally.
So.
And it's not like your clients are ever going to be like, I mean, Danielle's really good, but I just wish she had that PhD title. If you're actually helping them and their lives are actually being changed, I don't think that's the response they're going to have.
Yep, hopefully not. So no, that's really cool. That's a lot of the nitty gritty. Like I said, I really kind of dumbed it down, but that's
that makes that clears up a lot for me. That makes sense. And like they seem super similar anyways.
Yeah.
Other thing that obviously is like a big part of your story too is you got married.
Yeah.
And you met a French dude.
Yes.
So how did, obviously that's a huge story, but just kind of summarize like how that even happened.
Yeah. So, just so everyone knows, obviously I'm a Christian, hence why I talk about God. So that's a big part of my story. So I'm going to do that. Not to be offensive to anybody or in any way shove anything down anyone's throat, but it's just a part of who I am. So it's funny because my whole life I was kind of the one I was kind of boy crazy. Not in a way where I was, I had crushes on a lot of different guys and always just thought boys were so cute and things like that. I was that typical teenager where I was like, oh, he's so cute. Anyways, I say that to say, what was interesting was my whole life I was kind of like, oh, the very stereotypical American girl, what is my husband going to be like? All of these things, daydreaming. Well, it's funny because right before I met my husband, Jean-Philippe, I told myself and told God, okay, hands off. I'm done with having crushes on guys. Whenever you want someone to come in my life, he will come. I'm tired of looking through the crowds at cute boys. I'm over it. It's exhausting. And so it's funny because right when I said that, a few months later, a friend of mine invited me to Passion City Church, which a lot of college students go to in Atlanta, when I was in undergraduate at Berry College. And so I went with her to a college summer evening thing. And it's interesting because I was talking with some friends and Jean-Philippe walks up and it goes with his French accent, hi, I'm Jean-Philippe. And I was like, oh yeah, that's not gonna work. Because I always loved the accents. And I was like, yeah, I need to walk away right now. So I did. Which was very entertaining now that I think about it. And so I walked away and he ended up being a part of our friend group. And so unfortunately I couldn't escape him and had to be nice. And so it ended up where, long story short, we just really connected. It just felt very easy. And he had a lot of...
And he was studying over here, right?
Yes. So only for 3 months. So he came from France. He's a legitimate Frenchman. He came for about 3 months to do an internship at Tech in physics. So he's the brains in this relationship. But so we met and it just was very, very easy. I think easiest person I've ever been around. We just really connected and bonded and had a lot of the same values and beliefs. And so we dated for a month and then he left the United States and went overseas again. And we did long distance while he was in Stockholm, Sweden, getting his master's for a year. And that was so much fun.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Sarcasm very intended. And then, yeah.
But did you get to visit him during that time?
I did. It was actually my first time out of the country. Cool. Yes, I now have become a huge traveler because of that. So I went to France to visit his family for Christmas that year. And then for my spring break, for my Christmas present, he bought me a ticket to Stockholm, Sweden for my spring break. So I do not regret that at all.
That's so awesome. I've never been to Sweden. Sweden sounds really cool.
Yep, and in the winter, everything is frozen, so it was fun, except for when I fell on my butt a couple times. But that was still fun at the same time.
It's all part of the experience.
Exactly. But yeah, so, and then he came back a year later, and a few months after that, we got married. So
that's awesome. Mm-hmm. And did you have a ceremony there and a ceremony here? Or did you do it all here? Nice.
So we did the main ceremony here because we are very thankful his family and best friends were able to come over for the ceremony here. And it's cool because it was actually a multilingual ceremony. So we had translation the whole time because most of his family can't speak English. And so that was a very unique ceremony. And then
what did your family think of that?
They loved it. They thought it was really cool.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was a bit overwhelming at times because when you don't speak a language, your brain can get exhausted. Yeah. But everyone said it was really special and they all really enjoyed hearing it and thought it was really unique to be able to see both of the languages, especially because my family can't speak French. So I think it was a unique experience for them to be, they all think French is the prettiest language in the world. So they were all gawking over the French speaking.
Of course. So romantic.
Yes, exactly.
That's really cool. That's really fun. And then, when I think of, if I was getting married to someone in a different country, I would always be like, well, you're coming over here with me. And so you roped Jean-Philippe into coming over here. Did he ever want you guys to live in France?
It's actually funny. It was kind of I wouldn't say the opposite, but in the sense of I didn't ever want him to feel pressured like that. And so I was very, of course, it made sense for him to come over here because he would have a PhD over here at Tech. And counseling changes so much over states, just in the United States. There's a lot of stuff that there's not much reciprocity, and so there probably wouldn't be much over there either, going intercontinental. And so it made more sense logically for him to come over here, especially because I'm learning to speak French. I'm getting there, but I'm not a French native speaker.
But he already spoke English, so it kind of made sense.
Yes. And so it made more sense, but I always was very intentional to be like, I don't want you to feel like you have to come over here. Maybe at some point I can go over there. It was just, it made the most sense for not only our relationship, but also our careers. And so it just kind of happened that way. But it's funny, people ask that all the time. They're like, oh, so, you fell in love with a blonde American and came over here. She, got you, pulled you into it or whatever, got you into her trap. I'm like, no, I really actually felt kind of bad making him come over here because it's...
For the record, I felt bad.
Yes, exactly. I did feel bad. I mean, maybe it got him into my trap, but it wasn't on purpose. But no, it was just, it's hard.
He got you into his trap because you walked away.
I did. Oh, don't say it like that. It's
I'm
true.
just kidding.
No, it's true though.
It's not a bad trap. It was a good trap.
No, but he wins that competition and that's why it's bad. But no, yeah. So it was just kind of logical. We've talked about going back over to France. When we have kids and stuff, there's a lot of good things over there that we think our kids could benefit from. And not to mention, in general, we want our kids to be bilingual, but that it would be cool for them to see a different culture and have that experience. So who knows where we'll end up. We kind of just say wherever God wants us to go. I can do what I do pretty much anywhere. Like I've thought about going to India a few times to work with the women and children in the red light districts there. I love it.
Yeah.
But it really just depends. Although I would not raise children there because that would not be the safest, but unfortunately. So it really it just depends. We don't know where we'll end up. We're here for right now. We're considering moving in the next year out of state to somewhere like Colorado or New York.
Nice.
Who knows where we'll end up.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool when you I don't know. Because you're living in Kennesaw, Marietta area where you've grown up your whole life. And Jean-Philippe is tons of miles away from where he grew up. And so he's just living a whole new giant chapter. Yes. It's kind of cool.
Yes.
I've always thought about that if I married someone from a different country, how crazy it would be.
It definitely, it's exciting, and then it has a lot of its challenges too. I can only imagine being that far from my family, although we're talking about moving out of state, but at the same time that's different from overseas.
Overseas is just not as accessible.
Especially with the time difference and things like that. But we try to go back. It's not as often as we would like, but we try to go back at least once a year to visit his family, and we're actually going in about a month. So
nice. That's awesome.
So that's always nice to be able to go back, and we can stay obviously a couple of weeks, or else it wouldn't be worth it to fly over there.
I know.
So
I'm literally going to Europe for 9 days in a couple days, and so I'm
that's really short.
It stinks because it's so short of a trip, but at the same time, I just had to do it. But anyways. Yeah. But I got my plane tickets for super cheap. My round trip was only $500 something.
I'm very jealous about that.
Yeah. Skyscanner is awesome.
Skyscanner.
If you haven't used that website, anybody listening to this, Skyscanner, you can basically just set it to tell you alerts of anytime there's just super cheap flights. You can set it to just be flights to anywhere.
Wow.
You can be tell me just when there's flights to anywhere less than this amount. And it's cool because they'll have certain weekend getaway deals where it's I don't even care where I want to go. I just want to go somewhere, and it'll show you the cheapest flights to anywhere.
Oh, I need to look that up.
Yeah, Skyscanner. It's really cool. But I don't remember if that was exactly how we found these tickets because we were going for a specific weekend. But still, my brother was able to find them, and he was like, "Yo, we need to jump on this right now."
Yeah.
Yeah, because
that's
I paid
3 times or a third of what you can typically pay.
I was gonna say I've paid $800 one way before, so 800 or 900.
Usually it's about 12 to 15. It's usually about 1,200 for us each.
Yeah.
So it's quite.
That's another thing you gotta pay for 2 people. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. So,
but we love to travel, so it's worth it.
For sure. But anyways, to kind of move on from all of that, but that was really cool because a lot of people are interested in that kind of stuff too, because most people aren't marrying someone from outside of the country.
Yeah.
It's kind of a crazy thing. But to go back to like what you're doing right now and stuff, you just started a new job, right?
Yep, so I just finished my master's actually about a week ago. And so this week I started at 2 different private practices, one in Marietta and one in Rome, Georgia. And so like I said, I'm counseling survivors of trauma. I am specializing in, just because of my experience and because I love it, working with survivors of sexual exploitation. Some people call it sex trafficking. I call it exploitation because there's a lot more than just trafficking involved in the sex trade.
Yeah.
Survivors of sexual assault and childhood abuse. And so with that can come a lot of different things, domestic violence, just a lot of stuff. But those are what I guess I would call my specialties. And I love it. It's great. And so, yes, I'm starting to practice in those 2 cities. So for anyone listening, if you know anybody who is in need of counseling for any trauma they've experienced and would like some specialized counseling in that, feel free to email me at drtcounseling@gmail.com. I'd be happy to talk with them and see if I can support them and provide services for them. And so I'm doing that, and I'm also going to be leading a couple of PTSD groups in Rome, which is very needed.
Wow.
We're excited. We're partnering with a church up there to use their facilities, the private practice I'm working with up there, and I'm going to be leading a PTSD group for females and for men, because obviously that can be very important when there's been trauma for example, if there's been trauma from men for the women, that could be very triggering, and then vice versa. And so being able to have gender-specific safe groups for them. And then I'm also, like I said, I'm going to start teaching in August at Georgia Highlands. So I'm very excited about this new chapter.
That's super exciting.
Very excited.
That's super exciting. So you mentioned that you've like worked in sexual exploitation stuff for like so long.
Yeah.
How did you kind of like get into that? And like, obviously there's so much you could talk about there. So just kind of like go on that, because obviously that's a very passionate topic.
Well, that's another funny God story. I think God has a sense of humor, because growing up, I grew up with all guys, and I loved it because there was no drama, there was no emotions. Well, I shouldn't say no emotions, but it wasn't as emotional when people were mad at each other. You would just say you're stupid, like it wouldn't be this big dramatic ordeal where people are talking about each other behind their backs or things like that. It was just easier. And so even when I got into counseling or got into thinking about having a major in psychology, it was interesting because I had friends at that time that were females and stuff. Not that I didn't growing up. I actually had one best friend over the years that she and I were really close. But it was just, I still kind of stayed away from predominantly female groups because it could just get complicated. And so it's really funny because I started taking classes and learned a lot more about abuse. And so I started being like, I think this is something I'd really want to, support people in, because this is a really big need. And so as I was doing that, I started interning at the sexual assault center I ended up getting a job at, and started realizing I loved it. Also realized it was a predominantly female population. And I say that with a grain of salt because it's not, but a lot of the people who search out for services are female, because there's a lot of stigma behind the men who've experienced sexual assault. So there are men and women who've obviously experienced sexual assault, but regarding services, most of the time it's females, which I will say for anyone listening, if you've been through trauma, male or female, there was nothing that was your fault at all. And I really do encourage you to seek out help, because it is very challenging. It takes a lot of courage to seek out help, but there's no reason for you to believe you don't deserve that help. And so anyways, so it was funny because I went to a passion conference where they were talking about sexual exploitation, sex trafficking. And I remember just talking to God while I was there, and he made it very clear that's what he wanted me to do. And it was interesting because I actually walked into the bathroom having a kind of an argument with God in my head, going, this sounds really challenging and I don't want to do this, even though I love to do it, but it's hard. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. And there was actually a girl in the bathroom who was crying. And it's interesting because I just knew instantly with the work I was doing and just the way she was crying that she had been sexually assaulted. And so I went up and talked to her very briefly. I can't even really remember what I said. It was more just, you're not alone. Somebody else was with her too. I think a door holder, a mentor, or someone at the conference said, you're not alone. You're going to get through this. Keep fighting, something like that. And then I just had this feeling I needed to walk away. I felt like God was going, okay, your time's up. Just walk away now. And so I did. So I remember sitting there going, God, did I just change her life? And I felt like God was saying, no, she just changed yours. And from that day on, I realized that's what I wanted to do and that I was going to be hard. And it has been, but it's what I wanted to do. And so God's opened a lot of doors to work with a lot of different organizations, to go to India, to have a lot of very unique experience. I think sometimes this topic, there's always like social justice movements that are really big in different generations, and this is our big one. And I know over the years, sometimes I was worried that I was just going to be another voice in the crowd. I know that sounds really silly, but with a lot of voices, and I'm glad that a lot of people are standing up to this, don't hear that. But I was worried that I wasn't really going to have any openings because there's so many people trying to get into this field right now. And I've been really grateful that I have, because I think before I got into any of this, there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of things people don't understand. They're excited and they're passionate, but there's a lot that they don't understand and that I didn't understand. And getting into this, excuse me, I realized there's so much more to it. It's very complicated. And I've been very grateful and blessed to be able to hear unique stories, to understand a little bit better that there's just so much more to it than what meets the eye and what media can show.
What do you, so for a lot of people listening, when they think of, sex trafficking or sexual assault, they've got this idea in their head.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's so much that people don't understand, and they, if you could shed some light on that for people, like what are some of those like most common misconceptions and, stigmas or whatever that need to get out there so that people can better understand this situation? For sure.
So something that I've encountered a lot in this field, and it's something that I thought about too before I actually got into it, was a lot of people, when they think of sex trafficking specifically, and I'll get to the sexual assault piece afterwards, but they imagine this little young girl from the suburbs who a van comes and just picks her up and steals her. That happens, but it's very rarely the case. Most often, the girl comes from a home of abuse, and there's a lot of different factors that go into it, whether they use alcohol or drugs to cope and get involved in a unsafe crowd, or whether it's somebody who does come along and grooms the girl, kind of, saying that you'll be safe with me, you can get away from the abuse, things like that. And then they'll end up getting into unsafe, unhealthy relationships, and then in that way they get coerced. Or it could be that they need to survive. A lot of girls, a huge risk factor for sexual exploitation is that they're homeless because they come from homes of abuse or different dynamics like that. And so to survive, they might need to sell themselves, whether it's stripping, prostitution, becoming actresses in the porn business, whatever it is in the sex trade. There's a lot of different aspects to it, which is why I call it exploitation and not trafficking.
Because when you're thinking trafficking, you're thinking like literally shipping people around and like...
Right. So legally, from what I understand, trafficking kind of encompasses all those things. It encompasses, especially when there are minors involved, any exploitation is trafficking. I just like to use the term exploitation because I think it helps people broaden their perspective. There's a spectrum. There's a lot of different pieces to it. And so that's just the term I like to use, and I've heard people use in my field, which I prefer. Like I said, trafficking legally, for minors especially, that's the term. But it really can become, if people don't understand all the pieces, they can have a very narrow perspective. And then with narrow perspectives, judgment can become a lot easier to seep in. And so I like to keep it broad. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And obviously this topic is, very like taboo. People don't like talking about this topic. So I think the more that we can talk about it and share about it, and the less we can make it this social stigma that people don't want to speak up about or whatever. Kind of like what you were saying with men that are sexually assaulted. There's a stigma against that where, they don't want to speak up. There's a huge social stigma around even talking about sexual assault and all this kind of stuff. You were kind of talking about people that get sucked into it by someone that like kind of grooms them, or they're homeless or whatever. And like, what would be, so obviously it kind of escalates and there's a spectrum and there's tons of different levels to this. But like, as a counselor, and I know you've gone in and you've done stuff in India and the red light district and all that kind of stuff. What can people do to help? What can like normal citizens do if people want to go this super, more hardcore route that you've gone and actually really get like, so what can people do and how can people help and, all that kind of stuff?
So variety of options. One is obviously supporting local organizations that specialize in this, financially or volunteering. Another thing is people can go to trainings. I know in Atlanta, for example, Out of Darkness, before they have any volunteers, they make them go through, I believe it's a day or a weekend training. And there's a reason for that, to make sure that they understand more about this topic, because we all come in with preconceptions. And so people can go to trainings. People can go to school, obviously, which is what I did. But I think the thing that I would encourage people to do the most, and this is everyday people, like anybody listening, not even just people who are super passionate about this, keep your eyes open. I actually put this on Facebook a few days ago, and I think you saw it. A lot of people, we turn our heads to stuff that doesn't look quote unquote normal, to things that are scary. We turn away from it. So to give an example, the other day my husband and I were at Walmart, and I saw this girl, looked like in her 20s or so, and she looked in distress, visibly in distress, and crying and walking through the store at a fast pace. And instantly, and this is because I've had training, so that was a part of it, but instantly my gut was going, is she being exploited right now? Something is going on. Her face is in distress because of trauma. This isn't just it wasn't normal, if that makes sense. And my instincts were going off like crazy. But what's interesting is, even with all of my training, my instinct was to walk away, because a part of me was like, is it safe? Because somebody that's exploiting her or abusing her could be watching. If I go up to her, they could come after me. They could hurt her more. All these things are going through my head. And so I was apprehensive and I walked away. And actually we ended up driving, almost leaving the parking lot. And the conviction was just so strong. I was like, this is not who I want to be. This isn't who I am. And even somebody who's, like I said, had experience and years of training, I still had that pull to just walk away because it was quote unquote safer.
And it's like, not my problem kind of thing.
Exactly. And that's what our culture tells us, right? It's we're very independent.
Mind your business.
It's take care of yourself and mind your business. And, even that fear of, well, is she just going to think I'm crazy if I go up to her? I don't want to feel like I'm imposing on her privacy, all those things. But I couldn't fight it. And I reminded myself, this isn't who I want to be. And so we turned around and I went up and talked to her, and it turned out, and of course I'm going to be very brief to share. I'm not her therapist, but for her confidentiality, she had just been in a domestic violence situation, was abandoned at the Walmart by the person abusing her. And so I ended up being able to give her some resources, some counseling resources, a crisis line, a hotline, things like that. So for people out there, keep your eyes open. If something doesn't seem right, it's because it's really not, usually.
Yeah.
When we have instincts like that, most of the time we don't make them up, especially if we have that strong pull to walk away. And so not only keep your eyes open, but also have resources handy. There's a lot of different crisis lines out there for sexual exploitation. So like the Out of Darkness, they have a 24/7 crisis hotline for people to go get picked up if they're being exploited and they would like to leave the life. There's a Georgia Crisis and Access line for people who are struggling with suicidality or homicidality or different mental illness crises, and they can call that. There's just a lot of hotlines out there for a lot of different things. There's rape crisis centers and sexual assault crisis centers all over. So have those things handy in your phone. What's interesting is when I was talking to that woman, I didn't have internet. And so I started almost panicking, like, I don't have access to any of this stuff. But because I had saved a lot of those resources in my phone, the crisis lines, I was able to give them to her. And so it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're in business, if you're in education, if you're, working at a McDonald's. If you really care about being able to help people, have those crisis lines handy, because whether it's a friend, whether it's an acquaintance, whether it's a stranger, like that situation, things are going to come up, because this is not something that's uncommon. And so just be ready for that, and be ready to, like I said, be open to doing the hard thing, and also be safe. Mind you, in that story I just shared, I also had my husband in the car watching the whole time. So I wasn't putting myself in a position where anything, I was in danger. I was in public. My husband was watching. He knew exactly where I was. God forbid, it was a situation where there was a pimp or somebody who was exploiting her, who was kind of hoping someone would go up to her, which can happen too. I had protection. I had a plan in place. So also know, if there's situations like this, have a plan in place. Don't put yourself in harm's way in the sense that you don't have a plan to keep yourself safe and that person safe as well. If that makes sense.
Sometimes rescuing people, you might become a victim as well.
Mm-hmm.
And not even in the sense that you might, get trapped in the same situation that they're in, but like you said, you might get attacked or followed or whatever. And
exactly.
It's sometimes, obviously being the rescuer, it's a huge risk.
Yep.
One thing that I have kind of heard tossed around in recent years is like this idea that I'm going to try to word this in a way, it might come off as, offensive to some people or whatever, but I'm trying to word this in a way. But some people would say that, like, for example, prostitution or being in the porn industry is like empowering to women in some ways, because they're saying like, you can do whatever you want with your body if you want to sell it. And if you want to be a stripper, if you want to be a prostitute, if you want to be in porn, you go, girl, like, more power, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then there's also this, I'm not involved in that industry. I've never heard of a person that was in that situation that really wanted to be in that situation, but who knows? I can't speak for anybody because I'm not in that. But there's a conflict there, because there's some people that would say, like, well, if we're going to really embrace feminism and all this stuff, then we need to embrace this, that women can do whatever they want with their body and we don't need to police them on this. Like, what,
So my response to that is it's very complicated. And I'm actually going to default to one of my favorite authors, Rachel Lloyd. And if you're interested in getting to know more about sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, read the books Girls Like Us by Rachel Lloyd and Rescuing Hope by Susan Norris. Those are two fantastic books, some of my favorite. And also Renting Lacey, although I cannot remember the author right now. But Girls Like Us by Rachel Lloyd is fantastic. And it talks about a lot of issues like this. And so I'm kind of going to quote her here. Something she says is, it's a choice based on a lack of better options. And so let me explain that. So in our culture, for example, I'm only going to give a few examples because there's a lot of them, because it's complicated. It's a very complex issue. So I don't want to know. I don't want anyone to hear this and be like, these are definitive answers. It's every single story that every person I've ever met that has been exploited, their story is totally different. There are some similarities in how they respond, how they feel, but there are totally different stories. So none of these, it can't be black and white. So anyways, so for example, in our culture, it's a sad reality that I can make far more money prostituting myself or stripping than I can doing most things as a female. It's a sad reality. And so for women, whether they have children or they have addictions, because that's what they've used to cope with abuse for all those years or different things like that, to make money, unfortunately, that could be the best option for them. There's other factors. Like I said, it's very complicated. These are just a couple. When people have struggled with abuse their whole life, there's often an intense amount of shame that they're worthless, that they're not good enough, that they did something wrong, they did something to deserve this. And when people get into the life, even if they have a chance to exit it, whether they realize it or not, often they will not exit it, or they feel this pull not to exit the life because they feel like they deserve it. and that's where they have a place, if that makes sense. I actually wrote an article one time that says the abuse we know is sometimes better than the future we don't know. And often regarding sexual exploitation and in general, what we know as humans in general, whether it's, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a very simple example, whether it's just behaving one way in relationships or something as
like going to
extreme
school
as,
or dropping out or something. Like,
yes.
Like,
Yes.
you know, you don't want to be in the situation of school, but it's like all you know, and you've been in school your whole life. It's safe. And if you drop out, like, what are you going to do? You don't have a job. You don't have anything lined up. It's scary.
Yep. So as humans, it's not uncommon for us to veer towards what's less scary. And for women that are being exploited and have had years of abuse, it is far less scary to stay in cycles of abuse than to go and try and find something different. Especially if they're afraid there's not going to ever be anything different. They're going to be disappointed. And so there's a lot of pieces to that. But I really like the way Rachel Lloyd puts that sometimes it's a choice based on a lack of better options, whether it's financially, whether it's because of psychological reasons. Also, I mean, they could be threatened that if they leave, they could be killed. You know, there's so much to it. And also there's sexual addictions to consider. When people go through sexual abuse, it's not uncommon for people to experience sexual addictions. So they also could be pulled in that direction to stay in the life that way, to feed that addiction. And so it's a very complicated issue. So I will just answer that question that way, if that makes sense. It's very complex.
It makes a lot of sense.
There's no simple answer to it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's hard because on one hand, like you said, it is a choice, but it's a choice where you don't really have many options. It makes tons of sense.
And then other times it's not a choice at all, right? So there's certain situations, which are the ones that are often publicized, where people are just straight up trapped, right?
Of course.
But there are other situations where people are psychologically trapped. It's like I said, there's so much to it. It is very, I hope I'm explaining it in a way that people understand.
Yeah, it makes sense. Another thing that, is a huge issue today, and I know that we can't get into the political side of this, but, obviously, biologically, males can dominate females on a pretty much all the time level. And it's a scary thing because as females, something that I don't think about on a typical basis is when I'm walking down the street, I'm not thinking of, checking behind my back to see if someone's following me. I'm just not really thinking of that. It might be me being naive, but I'm not thinking of when I'm passing someone on the street, like, oh crap, this person could attack me right now or whatever. And so obviously, that divide is a hard thing to live with sometimes. I feel like as being a woman, it's just one of those things you kind of just have to deal with in society, that 50% of the population are probably could overpower you as far as physical. And I think that as humans, we want to try to control other people. That's probably why a lot of, these situations that you deal with are happening in the first place, because people want to control others. But what makes someone go down that path? Because I hate to be this holier than thou kind of situation, but I don't have that. I mean, and obviously another thing that Jordan Peterson, that guy that I've been listening to a lot, he talks about is embracing the shadow, meaning you don't really have power until you realize the dark side of yourself almost. I wouldn't want to assault someone, but I could see myself doing it, if I was in a certain situation or if I, whatever. Right. And so obviously people are in their own situations because of all the little domino effects that have led up to that point in their life and all that. But embracing the shadow, meaning you know what it's like to carry out such a dark and evil thing. What, on a psychological level, compels someone to be a sexual assaulter or a rapist or something? What, you've studied this a lot. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around wanting to do that. I don't know why. So
it's you're going to hate me for this, but it's also complicated.
No, it's okay.
So I've actually worked with people who have perpetrated violent crimes before. whether it's murder or with child abuse or things like that, or domestic violence. Because in reality, part of the issue with abuse is it's a cyclical pattern. So, for example, if somebody has been assaulted when they were a child, they may go and do the same thing because it's what they know. And it's because that's what's normal to them, things like that. Or because in their unhealthiness based on their trauma, then that's just the way they automatically respond to situations, whether it's domestic violence or assault or sexual assault, things like that. I also think, and trying not to get too political or anything here, I also do think it does have a lot to do with our culture. And a lot of people get upset, but research shows that pornography and over-sexualization in our culture can be very damaging to people's brains. And so I do think that could be a part of it too. And obviously all over the world, right, this happens. And and so that's only a piece of it. There's a lot of different pieces to it. But that, from what I've seen, a lot of the times it's that cycle of abuse that just keeps happening generation over generation over generation. And the unhealthiness that comes from being abused and the way it changes someone's brain. And that can be changed back, right? It's like any, I'm trying not to get too neurological or anything, but like for addictions, for example, the reason that people can overcome those addictions is because their brain can change.
Totally.
And
the actual chemistry of it.
Exactly. Like the patterns in their brain, the connections in their brains, they can actually change. And so it's similar regarding anything, including people who've been through abuse. It changes the way you see the world. It changes your perceptions of yourself and others. It does so much. But they can also change back. So it's not this hopeless thing. I don't want to ever paint that picture. Or else I wouldn't be in this field, right? Yeah. I would never be in this field.
And that paints people into this weird situation where you would feel hopeless, because if you can't change, then you're screwed. Because if there's no potential for you to actually change, then you're screwed.
Right. And then another thing, like I said, it's complicated. I'm only giving a couple of brief things for the sake of time. But also there's a lot of people don't like to talk about this, but sexual addictions are also, that they happen in our society and they're not uncommon. And so that can also be a piece of it, because if you think about somebody who struggles with a drug addiction, they will do whatever possible to get access to those drugs. And it's not even necessarily because they want to. A lot of the times it's because when someone's addicted to something, their brain thinks they need it to survive. Whether it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, porn, whatever it is, their brain literally thinks they need that to survive. And the choice part of their brain becomes damaged. So that also can be a piece. So it's complicated. I think a lot of times we've painted this picture as it's very black and white, where there's good people and there's bad people. The reality of it is, like what you were saying, we're all capable of really anything if we have the biological and the environmental pieces that kind of come into place. And so I think it's very important to recognize the dangers, and I think that's where the good and bad comes in. But I also think for those people who have been through trauma, or have like people, like I said, clients I've had who have done things that they've regretted, whether it's domestic violence or murder or things like that, I also think we need to realize that it's complicated. And for people who want to get better and want to change, we also don't want to keep them in that box of you're a murderer or you're this or you're that.
Yeah, it's very dangerous when we put labels on people. Or you're, another one that kind of, like you were saying with addicts, you can literally change the chemistry of your brain. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is like when your brain is changing, it's almost like a part of you is dying, and whatever's left is like the new, whatever was before and transcends that change. Is that the true you? Because then also you could also kind of change that later on. So it's weird to think about, especially when you go through these milestone events in your life, or a big thing or some trauma, or you turn a new leaf or whatever you want to call it. It's almost like you're dying to your old self and you're becoming a new thing. And it is crazy how your brain chemistry is actually changing. It's not like you're just, okay, now all of a sudden I'm this. It's like, no, you actually kind of are that now because your brain is different. It's not like you're just making a different choice.
So I think, I'll give you a couple analogies. I'm huge on metaphors. You can tell I'm a counselor when I share some of these. But I think I like to look at it as you're creating something else. As humans, we have the wonderful capacity to be able to create ourselves, right? So we have the biological and environmental determinants, but we can change the way we see things and the way we respond to things if we're actively trying, which is why therapy is so effective. Because people who want to change can do that. I will say though, and I'll give an example of abuse. When I talk to clients, I don't ever want to tell them they're going to completely heal. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people will want to heal and forget it and like it never happened. And the reality of it is that's not the case. And so your brain is not going to just forget it like it didn't happen and not ever have any effects of it, even after you go through a lot of work and you change some of the pathways in your brain and your perspectives and schemas and things like that. So the analogy I like to give clients and people in general is, if you think about it, say I had a really deep cut, okay, right? So it's in my arm or wherever, and it's bleeding profusely, and it could be dangerous because it keeps bleeding, and right. So I put a Band-Aid on it, but I might not heal it. It could just still be there. How I see healing in general, or I call it recovery. You might no longer have the wound there, but the scar will still be there. It won't go away, and that's not in a hopeless way. Things will change. But for people who have struggled with abuse, triggers might still come up. So for example, say somebody was assaulted in a white minivan. If they see a white minivan, when they see that, their body still might have a physiological reaction. The difference is it might not happen as often, or it might not be as intense as it might have been previously. And so the scar will still be there, but it won't be as distressing, if that makes sense. It's kind of like addictions. Addictions don't ever completely go away. People still have triggers at times, even if they've been in recovery for 20, 40 years, they're still going to have triggers where they feel the urge to use or act out or do whatever. So I kind of see it as that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
It's not an open wound anymore.
It's a scar. And
things change, but it's still going to be there. You just have learned better how to respond to it and cope with it.
Yeah, that's one thing that I was talking about with my brother the other day, because, I don't want to share his story without him sharing it, because I think eventually he wants to be on the podcast and share his story. But one thing that he was saying was like, I kind of wish that I could just kind of forget that whole piece of my life happened. And I was like, dude, that's like writing off all the progress though, because now that you know what you know, it's like when you break a bone, it grows back stronger, and you can use that as like a powerful thing. And now you can relate to so many other people that are struggling or whatever.
Exactly.
And it's almost weird in a way, because sometimes, I told my buddy Davis was on my podcast, and he's an addict, and he's, I think, been like 4 years sober now, which is really awesome.
Yeah.
And on the podcast, I mentioned, for lack of a better word, it's almost like I'm sometimes jealous of people that have overcome like something so huge like that, because I haven't had to face huge adversity in my life, which obviously is like a blessing, but it's also kind of like, well, damn, I've never done anything that hard. You know what I mean? And obviously I have done hard things, and like I've overcome a lot of things in my own life, but at the same time, it's like, it's people that want to just completely, I just want to forget that whole thing. It's like, no, that's kind of like a power. That's like a strong point now that you have that. But anyway, obviously I don't ever want to make it sound like I'm jealous of someone that's gone through traumatic things or whatever, because obviously that's not the case. But at the same time, it is extremely powerful when you can overcome something like that.
I think we all want what we don't have,
Totally.
I think a part of that is we always see the potential of others more than we see the potential of ourselves. Whether you've been through something traumatic and all of us have been through trauma on different levels, by the way. Like even a car accident can be traumatic. So we've all been through different types of trauma throughout our life. But when I say trauma, I think of like the, abuse, like the extreme types of trauma, but we've all been through it.
What exactly is like trauma? Like what's the definition?
So like if you're thinking about PTSD, for example, trauma or like a traumatic experience is when you have experienced something that was life-threatening towards you or towards others, or you've witnessed something that was life-threatening towards you or towards others. That's pretty much like the summary of it.
Gotcha.
And so if you think about it, all of us in different ways have experienced traumatic things, because we can have traumatic deaths in our family. Pretty much I like to think about it as your world gets flipped upside down and your brain has a hard time catching up. And that happens to all of us, right? There's going to be some really huge, drastic, traumatic changes in our life sometimes that we can't control, and there's nothing we can do about it, and our brain has a hard time keeping up. So that's kind of the simplistic version of what I think trauma is. So a car accident can do that, a miscarriage, a death in the family that's unexpected, things like that, But regardless of whether we've been through something, like you were saying, some huge adversity, whether it's trauma or addictions or whatever it is, or we haven't, we still have the potential to do a lot and help a lot of people. And even just have an open mind, and which is something that I've really admired in you in our friendship. You have a very open mind to listen and learn and hear things. And that's huge, because not only are you sharing that with other people through the podcast and other ways, but you're also modeling for other people how we can really help people. Because if we keep ourselves closed in a box and have our mind closed to things and have black and white thinking or whatever, we really can't be very supportive of people, because we won't open ourselves up to understanding the full picture and only see a piece of it.
Yeah, and our brains automatically want to compartmentalize people into boxes. And number one, I want to say thank you too, because I really appreciate the compliment, because I think it is important to have these like face-to-face conversations with people, because like, for example, there's been people that I've had on the podcast that I might know, we've had really awesome conversations before, but there are some people that I haven't been able to really sit down and have like a really awesome, cool conversation where we can talk about ideas rather than people. I feel like a lot of times when we're talking, we tend to talk about simplistic things, gossiping, talking about people. And I love talking about ideas and like progress and stuff. I don't know. It's just something that I enjoy. But anyways, our brains automatically want to compartmentalize people into these things. And like we've been saying this whole podcast, almost nothing is black and white. Like there's always going to be a spectrum. There's always going to be this conversation that needs to happen. And almost every single thing has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. You can't just write something off as 100%. You can't say all Muslims are terrorists. You can't say all, gay people are pedophiles. Like people want to like write off all these weird things that they just think in their brain because they've heard like one instance of this, so they just want to write it off because that's the easy thing to do. And now that I know what you are and I've put you in this box, I can move on and I don't have to think about it anymore. And that's what like you said with this podcast, like I want to be able to like break down the walls somewhat and have
get different
these
perspectives.
And get different perspectives and stuff like that, because a lot of times people don't understand stuff. And one thing that you were talking about with PTSD, I've listened to a few podcasts with people that were in the military and stuff like that. And obviously when you think PTSD, a lot of times you're thinking military, especially with males. For females, it might be sexual abuse or whatever, things like that.
And that's
like
also
you
a
said.
schema again. That's also a...
Totally. And that's me putting people into a box and making a stereotype. But when you hear about it, I feel like when I hear about men having PTSD, I typically am hearing about the military kind of stuff, because that's not as much of a social taboo to talk about.
There's not as much of a stigma surrounding that.
Because there's definitely men that are going through all kinds of other trauma, but they don't want to talk about it or bring it up or seek help because there's all kinds of reasons. But anyways, to go to the military thing, because that's a thing that I've listened to a decent bit. One thing that's interesting is that a lot of times, like people that are, I think we might have talked about this before, like Navy SEALs and like, what's the Army version of Navy SEALs? It's like, they're the ones that they're like in special ops where they're going in, like SEAL Team 6 or whatever, they're like going in to kill Osama bin Laden or whatever, and they're going in to do this mission, and they're on the offense. And a lot of times the general population of the military is kind of like on the defense. They're kind of sitting around. They might be sitting in a bunker. They might be cruising through the streets, kind of patrolling or whatever. And when you're on the offense, you're the assailant, right? So you're like you're the snake creeping up on the thing and attacking or whatever. And you are watching your back, but at the same time, you kind of know when that action's going to happen. And when you're just patrolling or standing guard, or when you're in the bunker, or when you're, all these other situations, you're the mouse and the enemy is the snake. And a lot of times, all of a sudden there's just gunfire and everyone hits the deck. There's all this crazy stuff. And so a lot of times the PTSD is triggered from these moments where there's just so much extended, just like, oh my gosh, at any moment I could die. 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 And when you're in these, and there's been studies that most of the time these military people that are in these offensive positions, they're snipers, they're, like I said, Navy SEALs or whatever, a lot of the time those people come back with no symptoms of PTSD, or very few, because they were the ones doing the traumatic action to the enemy, whereas the other, and I just found that very fascinating because I've never had considered it in that way, but it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I think it still depends too, because you'll only ever have so much control. So even a sniper, for example, another sniper could shoot down their friend right next to him, things like that. So but you're right. Something about PTSD is, like I was saying, it's that 180. Like you're everything just does a huge complete 180.
Like your whole platoon dies or whatever, and you are the only one who survives. Or even just one person, or even if you come close to dying. There's so much to it, but your whole world changes, whether it's minor or major. And I don't think anything is minor when people struggle with trauma or PTSD, but from the world standard, quote unquote, minor or major, it happens. Your brain has a hard time catching up with the change and the stress of it, and the danger that you're in. So yeah.
And something I want to go back to that you were saying earlier, that I agree. I think putting labels on people really limits them. And so it's interesting, and I'm going to call you out as your friend, but also because I want people on here to hear this too. You were talking about your friend who is an addict. Yeah. I hate that word. And this is why.
I hate it too.
Because it puts people in a box.
That's what I said. But the weird thing is he uses that term.
Yes,
which
and that's not uncommon either. That's not uncommon either. I've heard people who struggle with addictions can say that because it helps them take responsibility for it. Mm-hmm. But I personally will always say struggle with addictions because there's so much more to the person than the addiction. And I think, I can't tell you how often I hear it is, oh, they're just a junkie, an addict, this or that. And I'm like, you don't even know that person.
Yeah.
You don't know what they've been through. You don't know the trauma they could have experienced and they use this to survive. It's not the best way, but maybe that's how they survived,
Yeah, it could be.
So anyways.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's a very limiting term when you call someone that, because because for example, who knows? I could be an addict that's never used heroin. You know what I mean? Like if I used heroin, I might become an addict, and then all of a sudden I'm just labeled as an addict for the rest of my life. Like, and there's so many stigmas. Like I could be an addict to pornography. I could be an addict to video games. I could be an addict to something else that's not so public, and it's maybe not so physically detrimental, so people don't know. All this kind of stuff. And so on that podcast, I kind of talked with them about it. I was like, do you still call yourself that? And a lot of, like you said, a lot of times they do because they're taking responsibility. But on the other hand, I don't like that because it does like put someone into a box, and it does kind of, I would think, limit their own self-worth and their own potential, I guess. Because like you said, your brain chemistry can change. Like, I hate to be like, oh, well, I went to rehab and I got fixed. Like, because I don't know if fixed is the right word, because we're always going to have our own struggles and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's like you're not the same person that you were.
Yeah. Well, and I'm an advocate for if someone wants to unless I'm their therapist, because I will challenge people in therapy. But if somebody calls themselves an addict and they're finding positive results from that and that's what they want, that's a part of their identity, that's okay. But that doesn't mean I'll call them that, because that's just, personal preference kind of thing. But I'll allow them to do it if that's become a positive part of their identity. And I know for people who've not been through addictions, that can sound strange and that doesn't make sense. But for those who do struggle with addictions, it can be negative or it can become positive, because it's a way for them to empower themselves to go, I can overcome this. I have overcome this so far, things like that. And so I don't ever want to take that from them either.
Yeah,
but
totally.
Personally, from somebody who hasn't struggled with an addiction, I won't say that, because that does put them in a box that I don't want to put them in. So that's just, anyways, that's
that makes a lot of sense.
A little sidetrack there.
No, I like that. I was going to say too, I kind of forgot what I was going to say. We were talking about putting people into a box, labels, all that kind of stuff. Can't remember exactly. But anyways, to wrap up that part, I was just kind of thinking that people, I remember what I was going to say. People want to put their identity in things, right? Obviously, that's like a human thing to do. And on another podcast I had recently, I was kind of talking about how in a lot of primitive cultures, like, people that live in the woods and like, they don't really know or struggle with suicide typically, because their day-to-day is just trying to stay alive. You know what I mean? Or like, and you might not even have a choice of like what your role in the tribe is. Like when you're born, you're just like, he's this, and you've been trained your whole life and groomed your whole life into becoming this, because your dad was the carpenter and now you're the carpenter too. And it's so weird how in today's society we have to like form our own identity, which is beautiful and amazing that we can do that, but at the same time it's like a daunting task. And I think people, we get so caught up in like where you put your identity and stuff like that. And I try as much as possible to not put myself into a box, because I don't ever want to feel like I can't do something else. Like for example, with this podcast, I could go out and only interview entrepreneurs or whatever, or
Right.
I could go out and only talk to athletes, or I could go out and only talk to counselors or whatever.
Right.
But I want to have like a really broad spectrum. And in some cases that's like a hard thing as a podcaster, because now I'm trying to find my audience, like who's the person that wants to listen to this whole broad spectrum.
Right.
Maybe, I don't know, but it's hard. It's a hard thing, but I think it's an awesome thing too. But anyways, to go back, it's like in today's society, it's a very weird thing that we're having to like, where are you putting your identity? Where are you based in? And I think a lot of that is a reason why people go down these paths of, addiction or whatever, is because they end up putting their identity in these substances or whatever. Do you think that's like kind of true or not really?
Well, something I was thinking about, you were talking about like small villages, and something that popped in my mind is when I was in one of the red light districts in India, they had a lake that they called Black Lake, because the women would go and commit suicide there.
Whoa.
And so I think in some tribes what you're saying might be true, but then in other small villages like that where they're just trying to survive, suicide is still something that they struggle with. And so I think, honestly, and I'm just going to keep saying this, I think so much is complicated. And that's why I love about your podcast, because you give so many different perspectives to allow people to see the complexities of things. But I think identity is also complicated. I think there's a lot of pieces. I think we can create pieces of that, but we also can just be given pieces of it too. So when we're kids, we hear messages that might become part of our identity. Like, for example,
You're short.
or
fat.
or it could even be something positive. Like I kind of became a mom since I was 6. I was rocking my sisters to sleep when I was 6 years old. I mean, I didn't know a 6-year-old could do that, but I did it. And so I kind of became a part of my identity. I just grew up kind of being a caretaker, and it wasn't something that I chose. It was something that kind of became a part of me based on my environment. And so I think identity also is complicated. I think we can choose things healthy or unhealthy, but I also think we can be given things healthy and unhealthy.
Totally.
And so that's one of the wonderful challenges of human nature, is we're constantly, all of us, having to battle to create who we are in the way that's healthiest for us and works for us and looks different for every single person. But we've all heard so many messages our whole life that can be positive or detrimental, or they can just stick us in a box, which can also be detrimental. And so I think, it's complicated.
Definitely. It's very complicated. One subject that I did definitely want to talk to you about too is all these taboos around mental health. Because that's a huge, huge topic nowadays. People really are talking about mental health. And I think that we're turning a positive leaf on this as a society, trying to. And, obviously, anytime that there's progress, I feel like a lot of times it's kind of like the whole 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. But at least we're getting 1 step, because people will take it to this crazy extreme where it's like, all right, like we need to dial it back a tiny bit here or whatever, But I think that as a society, we're moving forward in a lot of different ways, which is good, obviously. But, we've talked a little, we just touched on like suicide and stuff like that. And one thing that, is super fresh in my mind is the singer of Linkin Park just committed suicide yesterday. And that's like a huge thing because so many people, going back to the identity thing, it's like they would see him as like, oh my gosh, he's got it made. He's he's the front man of one of the most iconic bands of all time. Right. So many people love and appreciate his music. He's loved by millions of people. And how could he do this? How could he be so selfish as to take his own life and rob us of this beautiful music that he had the potential to create? All this kind of stuff,
And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Anybody can struggle with anything.
Yeah.
So with mental health, I like to use the example of diabetes. So diabetes, it can just happen because of genetics, or it can be, and I have a limited knowledge of diabetes, but from what I understand, let me phrase it that way, it can happen because of biological predispositions, and no matter how healthy somebody eats.
Yeah,
but it also can happen because of biological predispositions and or people just eating really unhealthy.
Yeah.
And so I think of mental health the same, that it does not matter where it comes from, whether it's genetic, environmental, or both. It's a change in your body. It's a physiological change. It's something people cannot control. And so for anyone listening, if you have a mental health concern or issue or disorder, or know anyone who does, have grace on yourself or on them. Because like we've been talking about with addictions, your brain literally changes. And it's not your fault that it changes, regardless of if you necessarily picked up the heroin or whatever and it happened. You didn't ask for that change to happen in your brain. You didn't ask to get addicted. Now, that doesn't take away from the responsibility of, we all have things we need to battle and to fight, whether it's diabetes or mental health or whatever it is. We all have the responsibility of doing whatever we can to take care of ourselves. But for example, regarding suicide, there's so much to it, and a lot of people think it's just selfishness, it's just an easy way out. Often it's not what it is. It's and I've pretty much, most of the clients I've worked with at Grady have dealt with suicide or attempted suicidality because of the specific organization and program I worked with. And they didn't want that. They didn't want to be suicidal. They didn't want to have made all those attempts, but it was a complicated thing of dealing with depression or PTSD or bipolar disorder or personality disorders. And most of that is a combination of genetics and also because of the trauma that they had been through. And so people don't ask for these things, just like people don't ask for diabetes. It's their body physically changes. And then just like with diabetes, they have to do something to take care of themselves. Mm-hmm. And so like someone that's diabetic, they have to go through a lot more to take care of their body than I do, right?
Totally.
And so somebody that has mental health might have to go through some more to take care of themselves than other people who might not have mental health disorders or struggles.
Yeah. And there's no denying that. Life's not fair. Like some people have it harder than others. Mm-hmm. That's just like a fact of life. And that's one thing that, I've heard it ignorantly put out there a lot of times is people will say stuff like, well, everyone has the same shot or everyone, it's like, no, dude, like everyone's dealt their own cards and some people's cards suck. Like that's just, it sucks to say it, but like you got to be real, like at the end of the day, like, and a big thing that I hear all the time, especially with like depression, because obviously suicide and depression go hand in hand.
Right.
And, people, I personally it's never been something that I've dealt with. Obviously there's been times in my life that I've, been down or felt sad, or seasons of my life where I'm, feeling lost or confused or whatever. And I think, I hate to put it this way, but in a lot of ways, I think it's something to do with internet culture in a lot of ways. Depression is almost kind of like this, I hate to put it this way because there are people that actually are struggling with this and it's a very serious thing, but it's almost kind of like an attractive thing to put out there, like, oh, I'm depressed or whatever. Like, and so people will take pity on you or whatever, or, I don't really know how to pinpoint it, but I see it online where it's like kind of a hipstery cool vibe to be like sad,
well, and that can be like
I'm
anything.
So brooding
that,
and
yeah.
I'm just depressed and like, but there are people that really are, and it's very serious. I've heard it put this way, that depression, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you have a good definition of this, but I've heard that depression is like when, obviously everyone has ups and downs, but there's always going to be like a baseline. And if your baseline is like normal, like not happy but not sad, like that's good. But a lot of times people with depression, they may have happy days and good days, but they may have like really, really bad days. And a lot of times their baseline that they go back to is just bad and sad. Is that an accurate representation?
Somewhat. I think
obviously it's not black and white.
So I kind of, even depression is on a spectrum. So like everybody will have a depressed mood in their life. Everyone gets depressed at times.
Totally.
Because things happen. We lose people. We go through breakups, so things like that. But people who struggle with depression, and even people who have depression, are on a spectrum too. Some are more mild than others, and some are more extreme too. It just depends. But they typically, for longer periods, so I believe the DSM, which is our diagnostic, I believe it's 6 months or more, they have different symptoms that are chronic. So like depressed mood, worthlessness, inappropriate guilt. So feeling guilty when they haven't done anything to feel guilty about. Anhedonia, which means that they don't really take pleasure in things they used to, or they want to, things like that. So there's, and I know I'm going into like the symptomology here, but I think about it as, it's just, the simple way to put it is just more extreme, because we're all gonna, like I said, go through depressed times, everyone.
Of course.
But it's more extreme where it's longer term, and it can be a deeper sense of it, which even that I'm hesitant to say, because grieving can be very, very intense for a lot of people. And so that doesn't mean you're depressed or have depression. It just means you're depressed. So anyways, does that make sense? It's typically the intensity is higher and it's longer term. And when you deal with a lot of those symptoms at the same time, and it's distressing. So any mental health disorder, it causes the person distress. So it's something that they're distressed about, kind of thing. It interferes with their daily life, their functioning, things like that. Just like I'm going back to diabetes, that interferes with people's daily life, that interferes with their functioning. It's something that they're going to have to respond to accordingly to take care of themselves. Yeah. And so that's like depression. That's with any mental health disorder. It's something they're just going to have to respond to accordingly to make sure their body is taken care of. And their health. So.
Yeah, and I think people are being more keen to that nowadays. Like they're being more aware of that it's a real issue, and it's hard for people that don't have it to, like you said, if you don't have diabetes, it's hard to relate because you don't have it. But
right, or people will say things like, "Well, I've been depressed before and I got over it."
Yeah, or like just get happy.
Yeah, and that's not
go
how
outside,
it works.
Go work out.
That's not how it works, and that can be very isolating.
What obviously, we were talking about addiction earlier, and there's ways that you can overcome it. What are some of the, like, if someone's listening to this and they are feeling like they, maybe I am depressed, maybe I am going through depression, or they've been feeling that for a long time and they don't know. Obviously, seeking out help is a huge deal. But what kind of like practical things can people do to cope with that?
So. Once again, it's complicated. With every disorder, and I don't even like saying disorder because that sounds so negative, but with every mental health challenge, I'll say that, there's different research has shown that there's different ways to best treat it. So for some, it might be mainly medication with some psychotherapy. Some, it might not really need medication and only be therapy. So specifically, you asked about depression. From what I've read and understood, it depends on the severity of it. A lot of people will take medication for it, especially if it's more chronic, or something called dysthymia, which can be very chronic. It depends on the person, or if they're having suicidal thoughts, things like that. But with depression, often therapy is very important, and sometimes often medication in tangent with that. And like I said, it depends on the person. Not everybody needs medication. It just depends on how severe their symptoms are, how hard, how much it interferes with their daily life, things like that. But if anybody is dealing with depression or anxiety or anything that is a mental health challenge, I would encourage you to go see a counselor, and talk about options. Talk about and a psychiatrist. Like I said, some disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar, you need your medication. Psychotherapy will not alone help that. In tangent together, it makes it stronger. But there's certain disorders that you really need your medication. And so as therapists, we will constantly be working with people to encourage them to keep taking their medication, because we can only do so much. And so it really depends on the struggle and on the person. But go see a therapist. And something I'll say to anyone listening, I can't tell you how often in my life I have heard that people are weak for seeking out therapy. I 100% disagree with you and will always disagree with you. The courage and the strength it takes those people to walk into my office and talk to me about the most vulnerable places in their life, the things that make them scared that they're a worthless piece of crap, is far more strength or courage than anyone will have in trying to pretend like they don't have something they're struggling with, or just do it on their own. And I'm not saying that people can't do it on their own at all, but it takes so much strength and courage and vulnerability to do that.
Totally.
And so if you are struggling with something and you feel alone, you feel like you've tried on your own and it's not working, go seek out help. And it's okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. And you can even call a crisis line like the Georgia Access and Crisis Line and ask for some resources if you don't know where to go, things like that.
And sometimes I think people also are thinking, well, if I go to a therapist or whatever, it's going to cost money, and I don't have the money.
Yeah, and the reality of it is, if you're a college student, for example, you can get free therapy at your college. If some businesses will pay for you, if you're in business or in specific organizations, some places will pay for you to go get therapy so you can be the most effective within their company. But there's also therapists who will have something called a sliding scale. Well, they'll go down on their price to see people, especially people who are in need. And there's also, if you're religious, churches often, if you go to a church, often they'll have counselors who are free or low charge. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. And counselors, to be honest, if I could do this for free and not charge people, I would.
Exactly. But it's what you do.
Right.
You gotta live
have
too.
To live, but it doesn't mean I wouldn't go down on my pay for somebody because I want them to get help, right? Or wouldn't help at least find them somebody who's cheaper. Although there's a lot of therapists who are expensive, there's a lot of therapists who are cheaper.
Just so people, because sometimes people listening to this, they might be thinking, well, cheaper than $1,000, is $500. I still don't have that. What is a cheap therapy session like? Just to give it real numbers.
So I'll give you some examples. So some more seasoned therapists who've been who are fully licensed, who've been in the field for however many years, 5, 10, whatever, more than that. They can be anywhere from like $100 to $200 or whatever. But therapists...
A session,
right.
Yeah.
And so that can be pretty pricey, right? Especially if you're seeing people weekly, or even every couple of weeks. But then there's also therapists like myself or other people who are not completely fully licensed, although, like I said, it's complicated because we are licensed just at a lesser degree, and that's why we need supervision to make sure that we're like doctors or residents giving the best care we can possible. Some of us only charge $50 or $75 a session, which is about half of that, And even on that, people can be willing to go down depending on people's income or their needs or things like that. And that also depends on, in some organizations, are actually completely free. And so, like, for example, the Great Nia Project, where I've been working the past year, I've absolutely loved it. And they have free therapy, group and individual sessions for people who've dealt with, who've struggled with suicidality and domestic violence. And with that comes a lot of other trauma histories, but that's what they mainly specialize in. And so I just give you those examples to say, if you're a college student, if you're somebody who has a lower income, there are options for you. It might take a little bit more effort than just going online and just finding therapists near me, right? That's great. And you'll find a lot of different options, but some of those might be more expensive. But finding, low cost therapy, or even just call around to the therapy places and ask what their rates are. Ask if they have something called a sliding scale. That's the terms we use. Ask if they'd be willing to work with you, because most people, and this is my hope for our field, but most people don't get into this field to make money or just to make money, right? Yes, we have to live to survive, but we want to help and support. And there are bad therapists out there, just like there's bad anything. So take that with a grain of salt.
Of course.
But at the same time, there's options for you, and you're not alone in this.
Is there any telltale signs where you could, kind of see, okay, this might be a counselor that I want to stay away from? Are there any red flags right off the bat that would signal to someone? Because that's another big fear that people will probably have is well, what if my counselor sucks? Or what if he's bad? What if he's a bad one? Or what if he, whatever.
Well, one thing I would say is, obviously, if a counselor is abusive, no.
Obviously, yeah.
Right? And that can happen in any profession. But unfortunately, in any helping profession, whether it's nurses, doctors, dentists, you hear so often that they exploit their power. And so it doesn't matter if you're a counselor or your doctor or whatever, if anyone ever takes advantage of you or is demeaning towards you, just know. That's it. Another thing is something that I've talked to about with other colleagues is if you've been in counseling for a long time, say for a year, for example, you're with a counselor and you haven't seen much growth, that doesn't mean it's a bad counselor. It just means it might not be the best fit for you, and maybe consider other options. Like I said, that doesn't mean it's a bad counselor per se. It's just everybody, just like in relationships, we all connect with different people for different reasons. It's the same with counseling. I mean, we're still human. And we all also do counseling in different ways. And so it might just be time to then look into a different therapist who does things differently, and you'd relate to them differently, things like that. So, but especially if somebody is being demeaning, abusive, tearing you down, or not respecting, I've heard a lot of times people say their counselors didn't respect their choices. One of the big pillars of counseling is autonomy. We want people to be able to fulfill their potential in their way. I would never push my beliefs, my values on somebody. And if someone's doing that too, then I would just say be cautious of that and watch out for that. And if it's a therapist who really cares, I wouldn't just say straight up quit therapy unless, like I said, it's abusive, right? But often, one thing I would encourage you to do is talk to your therapist about it and see if anything can get resolved, because that can also be really therapeutic too. But anyways.
That makes sense. I know that you said we have to wrap up around 12. It's almost 12.
Okay.
But I had one last thing. A lot of times when people are contemplating suicide or something like that, they'll reach out to friends. And a lot of times those friends don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So if someone is reaching out to you and they're struggling with depression, they're struggling with, suicide or, anything like that, and you said you had people reach out to you a lot in high school, so that's obviously very common.
Right.
What kind of advice can you give to those people that are on the receiving end of that, where people are reaching out to them, but they're not a, therapist or anything, they're just a normal person?
Well, one thing is obviously be supportive, but also know your limitations and point them to a professional too. So like, for example, if someone's calling you and saying they're suicidal, one important thing is making sure someone's with them and they're not alone. That's important. But sometimes that doesn't work either. If you're out of state or don't know where they live or whatever, have the Georgia Access and Crisis Line, or whatever crisis line, whatever state or country you're in, handy that you can give them. And you can even call it to ask for some advice too. That's something a lot of people don't know is the Georgia Access and Crisis Line, for example, it's not just people who are immediately in crisis. It can also be people looking for resources to help those in crisis. But do really encourage that they go see a therapist and get some help. Because, I think a lot of times when we love people, we think our love and support can fix things. And that is huge. Don't get me wrong. I think that's one of the reasons therapy is so beneficial, and is because people feel supported and feel unconditionally supported, which we don't get very often. But if you don't professionally know how to handle it, you can only do so much. So love them, support them, give them resources, encourage them to go to those resources. And if someone is actively suicidal in the sense where they're about to kill themselves in that moment, you can also call 911. You can call the police, and try and get them help that way too. And even if you are with somebody and they're actively suicidal, even if you're there, I would encourage you to call 911, because at that point they do need some more support than just outpatient. They might need inpatient for some time, to help them stabilize and be safe. So.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, anything else that you want to mention? Or I know in the beginning you shared your email if anyone wants to reach out to you.
Yeah.
Or if there's any last things you want to.
Yeah. So a couple things. I never briefly mentioned the sexual assault myth. So just a few I want to say very quickly, just so if people are out there and they're wondering if they've been assaulted or know someone who's been assaulted. First of all, it's never the victim's fault ever. There's a lot of complicated things where people are like, well, if they were drinking, it's never the person's fault. Second is it happens a lot more often to men than realized. The last time I checked, this was a few years ago, so don't quote me on this. They change quite often, but the assault rates can be about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men. So that's pretty comparative if you think about it.
And you have to think about all the cases that go unreported too.
Yes, exactly. This is a very underreported crime, because a lot of times it's somebody that the survivor knows.
And it's also an undocumented crime typically, because unless you're into filming it or whatever,
it's a challenging one to prosecute.
Yeah,
for sure.
Exactly.
Another thing is it can be a male or a female who can be a perpetrator, and so that's something to keep in mind. Another thing, I was trying to remember what the other one was, but one thing that is very taboo to talk about, and it's not something we can talk about in length today, but a lot of people feel like if they've had any pleasure when they've been assaulted, that they must have asked for it. They must have done something wrong. And the reality of it is that it's complicated, but our bodies are made to feel pleasure in certain places too. And so, like I said, it's very taboo, and that's why I'm bringing it up. If you're somebody who's dealt with that and you feel ashamed, you feel guilty, you feel like you asked for it in some way, shape, or form, just give yourself grace and remember that our bodies are made to feel that. That doesn't mean you necessarily asked for it. And that's just another one of the myths. And for people who haven't dealt with it, be aware of that too.
Totally. That's a big one. That's one that a lot of times people don't think about too.
Nope. And it's something that's hard to think about. So a lot of people try to avoid it. But if you have dealt with that or anything and you want support, reach out to organizations, people around you, call a crisis line, go to your college counseling center, whatever it is. Get that extra support because you deserve it. Not because you quote unquote need it, but because you deserve it, because we all deserve support. I personally think everyone would benefit from therapy, but that's just me.
Totally.
Because we all have stuff that we can work on.
And a lot of times just talking through your life and issues and everything.
It's great.
Sometimes it's very hard to, it's weird. You sometimes can't process it all in your brain, and you need to speak about it and get it out.
Yeah.
But the only time that you can do that is when you have an audience. And that's sometimes what's really cool about this podcast too, is because it's sometimes somewhat therapeutic to talk about this stuff. Having face-to-face conversation is very, very powerful.
Yep. And being able to have a relationship, even if it's different from other ones, but one that's where the person is unconditionally supporting you. It can be that itself, I think, is part of the biggest keys of success to therapy, having someone who's really just there and cares about you. But yeah, and so besides that, I just want to say that I in no way want anyone to take my perspectives, the things I've shared, as the full picture either. I know I've quoted research, I've quoted different things, but just like anyone else, I'm also limited in my knowledge. And so I encourage you, if you have questions, if you have things, go do some research yourself, look at research articles, look at things that people are experts on. I by no means am an expert yet in things. And even then my perspective will be limited because I'm one person. And so I just want to say that I hope that you've been able to hear what I say, but also take it with a grain of salt. Just like you would anybody that shares anything. But yeah, besides that, just thank you for listening. And if you, like I said, are in Marietta or Roswell or in Ever, if you know anyone who's in need of support for trauma, feel free to email me at drtcounseling@gmail.com. But even if you don't reach out to me, which is completely okay, reach out to somebody if you need it.
There you go.
And
Cool.
that's all.
Awesome. Well, Danielle, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for
Hopefully it
having me.
wasn't as nerve-wracking as it was anticipated.
I
but
survived it.
Yeah, of course. It was an awesome podcast. I really did enjoy it. And I think people are really going to like this one. I'd love to do another one if you're up for it. Because like you said, we did not share the whole picture. I'm sure we could do a whole nother one. So.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Thanks so much, guys.
Cool. All right. Bye, people. There we go. That was it. That was really awesome. I can't thank Danielle enough for being on the podcast and sharing her perspectives on some really tough subjects, and she's a really awesome counselor. If you want to contact her about counseling, you can email her at drtcounseling@gmail.com. And you can also find her on Facebook as DRT Counseling. And I'm sure that she would also appreciate a 5-star review on her Facebook page. So if you enjoyed this conversation and want to give Danielle some props, go give her page a good review and go like it. That would be really helpful for her, I'm sure. And like I said, email her with any questions or any outreach that you might have. If you enjoyed this podcast and you know someone else who might enjoy it as well, feel free to share it with them. I really want this podcast to reach as many people as possible, especially if you think that some of the things Danielle and I talked about would help somebody that you know maybe. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that, like I said, is to share it. And also go to iTunes and leave me a 5-star review and leave me a little comment in there. You can just leave a 5-star review, but taking the extra minute to write a little comment apparently goes a long way in the iTunes ranking system. And as you guys know, I'm trying to get up in the rankings in iTunes. So that would be super, super helpful. And I'm not trying to guilt you here, but I've given you guys a lot of free content in the past couple months. The least you can do is go and give me a review and give me some feedback there. If you want to follow me on social media and all that stuff, you can find all my web pages, all of my social media pages on my website at andrewdeitsch.com. That's Andrew, DEITSCH.com. You can find all the links to that stuff there. The next episode that I'm releasing will be the weekly update, even though it hasn't really been weekly. Maybe I'll turn it into a bi-weekly thing, but that I will be talking all about my trip and my travels and going to Tomorrowland and Amsterdam and Milan and Belgium and all that stuff. So if you want to hear all about that, stay tuned. See you later, everybody. Y'all are the best. Love you guys, and thanks for listening.